remember there was one student, and I asked him, "Do you ever record yourself?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Why not?" Because it's something at least I find very useful. And he said, "Because I know I'm not going to like what I hear." And I was like, yeah, I'm sure that's true, but that's actually all the more reason you should do it. And then, and then we sort of got into this thing of, but then, because of course I understand, then of course, if you just hate what you hear, then you just want to give up. But then of course, you've got to focus on just being very, removing yourself from it enough to just be able to very dryly point out what the things are that you don't like, and then just tackle them one by one. It's like kind of being like a doctor.
James Oesi is one of those names that's been recommended to me time and time again for the podcast. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting with someone who has been recommended to me time and time again. I keep this log of every time someone recommends a name, and James Oesi has come up many, many times, and for good reason. He is a fascinating voice on the double bass as a soloist, and he has done so much for the instrument, organizing the Dutch Double Bass Festival, which had its first run in 2017. He has had a remarkable career, really exploded onto the scene about 10 years ago. We talk all about his background. He studied in Russia from South Africa, then studied in Russia, then went to the Netherlands, where he lives now. And this is a deep dive into all sorts of things that I love chatting about. Focus and workflows and what you do on a day off even. We talked about that. Different approaches to the bass, thinking about the bass as a solo instrument, challenges that James has had and that he's overcome. You're just going to love this. Great, great conversation. What a cool guy. And I can't wait to connect with James for a round 2 and a round 3, which are absolutely going to happen. We've got some great sponsors for this episode. We have D'Addario Strings, Upton Bass, and A440 Violin Shop. More on all of them later. And you'll be hearing a bit of playing from James throughout the episode, and learn more at his website, jamesoesi.com. All right, let's dive into our conversation. Of every time someone recommends somebody to chat with, I have a spreadsheet, and your name has been on that time and time again. So people
really?
say, "Oh yeah, you got to chat with James. You got to chat with James." So thank you for chatting. And
no, of course, thank you for having me.
And I mean, something that I think would be interesting, at least for me, and probably for people to hear, is like if we go back to like almost 10 years ago, and now where you are now, like, has your career unfolded the way maybe that James 10 years ago would have expected? Like, how is that? If you went back and talked to, 19, 20-year-old James, I'd love to know what that conversation might be like, just about your career.
That is such a good question. No, that's such a good question because if I look back at myself then, I mean, I was always extremely ambitious, and I did things in retrospect quite young, but actually not. I mean, they didn't feel very young. And so when I came here, I came from Moscow, where I had been studying for 4 years, and what happened. So I was sort of thinking of where I was in my headspace then was very much formed by the 4 years in Moscow prior. And funnily enough, it was, so when I went to Moscow, I was extremely ambitious and idealistic. I was 16. And I was very pragmatic. I went there because there was a great teacher, and I basically, sort of to boil it down to the absolute essential reasons, I felt like I wanted to become really, really good. I wanted to have this really big career. And I thought, well, yeah, if I want to have this big career and be this great musician, then I have to be a great musician. And I'm far from being a great musician. And in my mind at the time, the qualities that were lacking the most were discipline and technique. Because I felt like I'd begun the bass too late to be kind of the musician I wanted to be. So I felt like I had catching up to do. And I went to study with Lev Rakov, and that was the mission, was to have really good technique and be really disciplined. And whilst I was there, and I always had the big dream of being a big soloist. And it was interesting because, when you're 16, and saying this always sounds a bit depressing, but it is still so, thankfully. But when you're 16, everything is possible, which is good. Like you feel like, well, yeah, of course I'm going to do that, or of course and that's how I went there. And that got me quite far just in terms of my own personal sort of development with the bass. And I had a great relationship with my teacher there. But by the time I got sort of out of the meat grinder, 4 years later, and these things you also sometimes only really realize them in hindsight. I was a little bit sort of, jaded is a strong word, but I had kind of, because I think I had, oddly enough, even though I had good goals, I think I had an unrealistic idea of how I would attain them and what that would look like. And I knew a lot of people who sort of had careers when they were in their teens. And I remember thinking, oh God, I remember looking at that with part admiration, it's sort of like a little bit of a lot of admiration, also a little bit of feeling completely beneath those people, and so like also a peppering of envy. You're like, oh gosh, that and which was very funny. So by the time I got here, I kind of was a bit. I don't know if I still saw for myself what I saw for myself when I was 16, basically. I still wanted the same things, but I didn't. I think back then, sort of 10 years ago, I don't know if I thought they were still possible, which is terribly sad, actually, if I think about it. You're 19 years old, 19, 20. Everything is still possible. But I think I sort of felt a bit like, well, okay, I'll see where this takes me. And because also up until that point, I'd always been extremely sort of not control freaky, but very much like, okay, I'm going here to accomplish this. Everything was very cut and dry, black and white. And I came to the Netherlands. It was a bit of a funny story. It was partly, I'd been in Russia for 4 years, and I was doing, in the conservatory, I was doing fine. I was doing well even. Personally, I found it a bit, it wasn't, it was fine, but it was a bit of a lonely place for me at least. But there was a point at which I sort of got back in touch with my ambition of prior. And I realized that I was not really satisfied with being in Russia. And because it was a weird thing. It was because I felt like I sort of needed somebody on my side on top of my teacher, because my teacher was fantastic, but he and I would always argue about whether or not a bassist could be a soloist, which was like, I mean, we all, it's such a topic, but he was kind of like, from the beginning, he was like, no, I believe in you. Like, I really think if you work properly, you'll get far, which was sort of, always kept me going. But he would always have like some angle of like, yeah, you want to do that, but you're not a violinist, you're not a cellist, you're not a pianist. Like, be realistic. And that I, for the longest time, I never let that bother me. I was like, it's like water off a duck's back. But at a certain point, I remember him sort of like, we had this big talk. I think it was like in my fourth year there actually. And he was kind of like, yeah, but the best thing for you is just to like really become a good orchestral player. And then if something happens, it happens, And I was really like, oh, that's so not good enough for me. At least, like that's not my ambition at all. And at that point, I remember sort of thinking very pragmatically, well, okay, if there, I was looking at sort of like opportunities around, because there are always, when you're young and you're at conservatory, there are often sort of young artist programs or things or competitions or what have you that can help. And I remember sort of looking around for things there in Moscow where I was, and everything you had to be Russian for, which was kind of, was for me a problem. I was not Russian at all. I was a foreign student. And so I sort of thought to myself, okay, well, if there's none, if I can't find opportunity here, I will just look elsewhere. And I ended up finding out about a Swiss foundation who had helped a violinist friend of mine who was doing very well at the time. And you could just email them for an audition. They were a young artist program who they were kind of like a pre-management thing. So they would sort of help you, but they would help you, if you needed a new teacher, they would help you. It was kind of to make you a better musician with an eye to having a career. Sorry for saying career like that. It's just, right. I don't know. And I got in touch with them, and I ended up, I took the train with my bass to Switzerland to audition. And I did the audition. They were really good, actually, because they were very no-nonsense, and they were very honest. And they basically said, look, there's like a lot of stuff in your playing that needs a lot of improvement. There's, which I completely agreed with. But they were like, yeah, but we really think if you improve that, you could, they I don't know, they sort of seemed they seemed to believe in something in me that I was like, well, great. At the time, I was kind of like, I don't know what it is, but great. And like I said, they just seemed very pragmatic about things. Their artistic guy, I don't know what his proper function was, but he was in the audition, and he is a conductor. And he was a cellist back in the day, and he studied with Jan Ostaker. And he worked a lot with Gary Karr, and he commissioned the Joseph's Concerto, I think, is it, with Gary, and he did quite a few commissions with him and recorded with him a lot. And he in the audition said, because he also had a very no nonsense sort of approach, and said, well, what is your big dream? And I was like, oh, I want to be this big soloist. And he was kind of like, yeah. He was like, all you bassists, you come in here, you give us the same story. But the fact of the matter is, these were his words, mine. He said, the fact of the matter is there's only ever one, like, really proper soloist on the bass. And everybody has, in terms of career at least, paled in comparison ever since. And he was, he said that was Gary Karr. And, and I was like, well, I don't know if I would agree with that. And he's like, yeah, whatever, whether you agree or not, that's how it is. He was, he's very just cutting to the chase. But basically, his point was valid. He was kind of like, why do you think you're better than all these other really great bassists who want to be soloists, but we never hear about them? To which I didn't have an answer. Basically, he was like, look, I think their advice was, the first thing you need to do is you need to leave Russia, which I was like, okay, because I had 2 more years to go there until I could graduate. And so and they said, and I was like, yeah, okay, but I was like, why, it's not the happiest place, but I do have a great teacher there. And, I don't want to just leave my teacher like that. And they were like, okay, well, but if we could find an equally good teacher, for you somewhere else, here in Europe, for example, would you be up for it? And I was like, well, I'm open to it. I'm not going to say no. It would have to be worth leaving my teacher. And so basically and then they were like, well, we'll get in touch with Gary and see what he has to say. And I was, of course, super starstruck. And I was like, oh, wow, they're going to call Gary Karr. Oh, my goodness. And Gary had been a sort of big, hero of mine. And sort of long story, it's already a long story, but long story a little bit shorter, that the result of that was that I, within a few months, came here. And it sort of turned out it wasn't the idea was that, because like I said, I was extremely loyal to my old teacher in Moscow, and I still am. And so what I tried to do, because Gary put me in touch with a teacher here who is a former student of his, and it was he taught at the Conservatory of The Hague. And so what I did, I sort of tried to do best of both worlds. I thought, okay, well, I don't want to, clearly there's something here. Clearly there's opportunity. I don't really know exactly what that's going to look like, but I don't want to say no to it. But I also don't want to, I don't want to just turn my back on my teacher who's I owe so much to. So I tried to combine my last 2 years in Moscow and then come here after graduating, because I also felt like I've slugged away for 4 years. What's another 2? But at the end of the day, that was not possible. It's sort of bureaucratic thing. And I had said, well, if I can't do that, if I can't combine my last years, then I have to leave, because otherwise they don't really, they don't take it seriously. And that was 2 weeks before I was going to go actually, to Karr camp, which they had also sort of organized with Gary. And so I sort of picked up the phone and phoned who would be my teacher in The Hague and said, well, I know we've discussed me like coming to study there next year, but could I actually come in 3 months? And he was like, yeah, sure, come along. And so I ended up here. And so it was, unlike all the choices that I had made, it was very much sort of ending up somewhere and thinking, okay, I don't really know where this is going to take me. I'm sort of back aligned with my goals and stuff. But so back to your question, which was sort of dancing around. What would I say then? That I was way too cynical about, actually, at that age. That I've now realized is not a lot of things of how I thought making a career or getting solo engagements or worked is just not true at all. And that I now realize, like, a lot of things are less, I don't know, on one hand, less frightening than I thought they would be. So it would be nice to sort of say that, I guess I would tell myself that, don't doubt your first ambitions. I think that's what I would say to myself.
This episode is brought to you by the A440 Violin Shop. It's located just down the street from Wrigley Field in beautiful Chicago on the north side, just off the Brown line. I have been going there my entire adult life, and they have been fantastic, both for repairs. I've had cracks repaired. I've had seams glued. I've had all sorts of students go to A440 to get instruments, to get bows. They're available with a smile, do wonderful work, and definitely check them out if you are in the Midwest. A440violinshop.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Check out their Helicore strings, which are designed, engineered, and crafted at the D'Addario String Facility in upstate New York. And they come in all kinds of string sets: orchestral, hybrid, pizzicato, and solo string sets. They come in different tensions, light, medium, and heavy, so you can find a string that works for you, for your student's bass. I've been a fan of Helicores for years. Check them out, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, D'Addario. Yeah. Isn't that interesting how people could, because I think I was similar when I was 19, 20, around there. I think I'm 41, 40, almost 42. And I'm like probably the most positive and the least cynical I've ever been in my life. And I'm sure that 19, 20-year-old Jason would just be, I would love to hear that conversation, because I was so scared and paranoid and jaded and just everything you're describing.
Yeah. It's bizarre, isn't it, actually?
Yeah.
Because it's sort of really dangerous. I was very much looking for other people to tell me that my playing was acceptable. You know what I mean? Which kind of makes sense. On one hand, I understand where that comes from, but on the other hand, I remember once the sort of I had this sort of moment of I think it was the year after I graduated here in the Netherlands, or the year of my graduation, where I felt like I wanted to do a tour to South Africa. I'm originally from South Africa, and I thought that would be like a good solo experience, like organize a solo tour there. And I remember being just terrified to like pick up the phone, because I remember thinking, and by that point I had the courage to put some videos up on YouTube. But the idea of sort of calling up an orchestra and saying, I'd love to do a bass concerto with you, or, calling up a concert series there. It was just terrifying. And I sort of did a very half-hearted job of it, and it didn't ever happen because of that. I called some people whom I didn't know, and, it was like, your heart's beating. And then I remember there was a programmer who was like, we were discussing the details of it, and he at a certain point he said something like, he said, look, your playing is beautiful. We'd love to have you here, because it was basically, he was trying to keep his series alive, and he didn't know if they could make it happen. And I was the whole time thinking, oh, he probably just doesn't want me because I play out of tune, or or whatever. And then at a certain point he said this, and I was like, oh, really? Like it was so. I was like, oh wow, oh they want to have me. Wow, that's so. It was such a, which is. I think I would rather err on the side of thinking that my playing is terrible, and it's maybe not, than thinking I'm God's gift to the bass, and that is of course not. But it's okay until it stops you from doing things, basically. So I think that I would also try and tell myself.
Oh yeah, and I think it's something we musicians, and particularly those of us who spend all these hours in practice rooms polishing these little details. It's so hard for us to. We're so critical of. So critical.
Yeah. It's such a tough thing, and the thing is, and I must say, this is something that I am very happy that happened, because I was doing my master's here. They put me in secret, although I'm graduated now, so it's fine. But I had applied actually just to transfer because I hadn't graduated from Moscow. But they just put me into the master's program, and so I didn't question it, and I just did my master's. But part of what you had to do as a master's student is you had to do artistic research, which is a very bizarre thing. But basically, what I did it was bizarre because they wasn't very clear what we were supposed to do. And what I ended up doing is just being extremely, my sort of topic was just very pragmatically picking apart my own playing and seeing very academically what were the sort of most glaring problems, and how could I then fix them, and sort of trying all sorts of different methods that I hadn't tried before, because clearly what I had tried before was not working, and seeing how that could help. And I must say, like, sort of abstracting myself from my own playing like that was an extremely good exercise in having a somewhat healthier relationship with the critique you give yourself and yourself. And it's something I've noticed a few years ago, I was assisting at The Hague for about a year and a half, and there were a lot of students there whom I would see quite often. And I noticed it with them, is that, and like you just said, as musicians, being so focused on all the details can be so critical. And I noticed it with some students who would be so critical that it would cripple them, that I remember there was one student, and I asked him, do you ever record yourself? And he said, no. And I said, why not? Because it's something at least I find very useful. And he said, because I know I'm not going to like what I hear. And I was like, yeah, I'm sure that's true, but that's actually all the more reason you should do it. And then, and then we sort of got into this thing of, but then, because of course I understand, then of course, if you just hate what you hear, then you just want to give up. But then of course, you've got to focus on just being very, removing yourself from it enough to just be able to very dryly point out what the things are that you don't like, and then just tackle them one by one. It's like kind of being like a doctor. And I remember I had that also with a student who was at the time who was working on excerpts, actually, which is, I really don't, it's not my speciality, but still, and she was sort of just felt so hopeless about it, because to her he ear, everything was bad. And I was like, well, look, like, what's the worst thing? Like, just tell me what it is. And then it was, I can't remember, but it was articulation. So I was like, okay, well, let's work on that. And, and if you have the right tools, at a certain point, you can work on something efficiently enough that you very quickly start to notice improvement. And then that, and that's what happened, luckily, in this case. And then she was like, oh yeah. And I was like, but look, you see, if you just work through it like this, then you're using this sort of critical aspect to your advantage, because you're making, everything better. So that's something I try and always remember, which is more, I guess, something that I'd learned from myself back then, luckily.
Yeah. Luckily. That's such a key point. That's such a key skill to get, though. And that's something, and I mean, we're so passionate about what we do, and we let that bleed over into, all these aspects of the learning process. But when people can be objective, just like you're describing, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means measure 3 is rushing. Let's just fix measure 3.
Exactly. And it's funny because it sounds so logical and so obvious, but I know for me it took so long. I remember I did a competition once back when I was still studying in Russia, and one of the jury, I think the head of the jury, like before they announced the results of the first round, and I got kicked out in the first round. And before they announced the results, he said something like, he gave us this sort of speech of, I really don't like this part because it feels like it separates people and it puts some people into the camp of the good and then the others into the not good enough. And, and he said, I want to assure all of you that, even the best people can have a bad day. And just because if you're not through, it doesn't mean... He said it, and they were actually kind words. A lot of people, and we were all that age, of being extremely cynical. So a lot of people were kind of like, "Oh God, just get on and tell us, tell us who's into the next round." But they were actually good words. He said, "I just want to assure you all that for those of you who are not in, it does not mean you're bad players, and certainly does not mean you're bad people." And it's funny because I was like, "Oh yeah, actually, I guess not," And it was sort of, it sounds sometimes extreme, but it is exactly what you just said,
Isn't that the tricky thing with competitions? It's such a sticky thing because it's both something that, I mean, I understand the need for I understand their purpose and how they, as a career advancement tool, even as in the right circumstances, a tool to get better, learn repertoire, promote new repertoire. There are all sorts of positives, but obviously just the whole nature of competition in general, and in this music and this art we're doing, it's sort of antagonistic at the same time.
It is because the problem is, and it's funny because I must say the older I get, the more anti-competition I become, which is not. And the thing is, like you said, there is positive about competition, and there are some people and some musicians for whom competition is actually really beneficial. And I know some who they do really well in competitions, and in a way that they do well also for themselves, also personally. And I know I've in some competitions that I've done in the past, just preparing for them was positive enough. It's sort of like just putting yourself through that ringer was already worth it before even sort of stepping foot on the stage. But indeed, I feel like the negative sides of competition it can be so insidious, and I feel like just the act of comparison is already so dangerous. I mean, I know if I want to make myself feel really bad about myself, I will listen to other recordings of pieces I play by other bass players, whom I think are good, and I will just feel terrible, And it's really, and it's so dangerous. It's because, and I mean, not to say you can't listen to other recordings of people doing what you're doing, but when you're listening to compare, for me at least, it's really deadly. It's really kind of, I don't know, it's something that's very antithetical to making music and making art. And I don't know, it's tough. And and that's not even getting into if you if you get rejected, and inevitably, if you're doing a lot of competitions, you are going to get rejected at some point. Even if you're one of these people who always comes first place, there's going to be one competition where you don't. And I don't know. I mean, it means so much. Like a rejection can be so painful, and I don't know why it feels like. I mean, at least for me, I so often, and I feel like I'm getting better at this. But when I was younger, like being accepted to something, I always felt like. I mean, I was always happy, but but it was kind of like the joy of that was not comparable to the pain of being rejected, which sounds so dramatic, but yeah, it was often like this, and I remember even and you can give it much more weight than it deserves.
Totally. How often we minimize the positives, we minimize our successes, and we maximize those rejections, those negative moments. And I mean, we've all gone through that with whether it's an orchestra audition or a solo competition, or even calling up an orchestra and them not being interested, or
exactly.
and like that's something that I think people learn how to manage and get through, or it just really beats them up. Like for me, if a major rejection happens, I've had enough in my life at this point that I just tell myself, look, I'm going to feel bad for a day. Most of the time I can just sort of wash out. And it's like, generally, it's been years since something major enough has happened that in my career, that's more than like a day of being kind of blue. But like, how do you pick up and dust yourself off? Cause I mean, even now with what you're doing, obviously like not every day is a good day. Not everything turns out the way you want. How do you handle, rejection and disappointment and that sort of stuff, these days?
That's a really good question. Well, you know what? It's funny. I look at it extremely differently these days. Mm-hmm. I look at it much more. It's a very funny thing because I'm very lucky. I have a really a great partner, boyfriend, and he comes from the jazz world, and he used to work at the jazz radio station here. So he's one of these people who he's a music industry professional, but he's not a musician, and he doesn't come from the classical world. So he looks at things much more in terms of like audience and touring and a bit like how the pop world see things. And it I must say, ever since we've been together, it's given me such a fresh perspective on actually how similar all the different music industries are, and how actually at the end of the day, I mean, as a solo artist, you are connecting with an audience. That's kind of that's kind of your goal. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're expressing your music, and you're trying to find the people it will resonate with. Yeah. And the thing is, those people are out there, so that's great. And I sort of think, and that gives me an awful lot of comfort when I get rejected, because I think, but the people who find what I do great are still going to find it great, even if whatever orchestra doesn't want to play a bass concerto with me. Yes. And that is and it's funny because I sort of also turn it around and I think of like artists I love to listen to and extremely admire. And I think, I will, somebody said to me once, they said, they were actually on the jury of a competition where the criteria that was given to all the jurors was actually really simple. It was simply, would you, with your own money, buy a ticket to this person's concert? And he said, this is how you need to look at things. Because he said, if you actually ask yourself that question very honestly, there are very few people that you would do that for. And he said, but when you do find the people for whom you will buy a ticket to their concert, you will not only buy a ticket to their concert, you will buy their album, you will buy the documentary about their album, you will go, you will visit them when they go on their concert tour. And I thought, he's right. He's absolutely right. Like all the artists that I absolutely love, I cannot get enough of. Mm-hmm. And even if they have a bad day, even if they have a bad performance, I still will love, I will still love their playing. And somehow looking at it like that, I must say has given a much it gives a lot of comfort in rejection, for me at least.
That's great. And what getting that perspective and the audience perspective,
Yes.
that's such a, and just remembering that those people are out there, whatever the behind the scenes machinations are going on,
Exactly.
they're still out there. They're still wanting to, connect. This episode is brought to you by the Upton Bass String Instrument Company, a company that I have been such a fan of over the years. Gary and Eric and all the good folks at Upton, they do extraordinary work. They've been at it for a long time, and it has been so much fun to watch them evolve over the years. And a question they get asked a lot is, what's the difference between their Bohemian model bass and their standard model basses? And basically what it boils down to is they come from the same basic outline, but there's much more customization available in a Bohemian bass. So Upton standard basses basically look like each other. They're either laminate, hybrid, or carved, but they're similar in their form, while you can get your Bohemian bass customized if you want hat peg tuners, if you want all sorts of other details. That's the bass you can customize. And if you haven't been to the Upton website recently, they're constantly adding new videos, new photos, new descriptions, and every bass has a story. And I love following along with these stories. Visit them at uptonbass.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast. Speaking of connection, and you mentioned it before, Gary Karr. Okay, so
Yes.
Gary's out here, and I actually just last Sunday spent the day with Gary and Harmon at their place in Las Vegas, and we chatted for the podcast, and they played for me and everything. And I mean, talk about someone who can connect with an audience, and someone you've had experience working with, but yet you're a quite different player than Gary, and just about, though there's that connection with the audience. I mean, just in terms of the way you approach the bass, the repertoire, I just love to know what that experience was like for you, meeting him, working with him, what you learned, what you think maybe you carried over. And again, sorry for these massive questions, but
no. It's really food for thought, really interesting. And a really good question. It's interesting because my experience of it was very, at first it was very bizarre. It was very surreal. I had, and I feel like, I mean, because there's two things. There's firstly, and there's this sort of, you're meeting an idol, at least for me, because he was really, I was not, growing up, he was a bass player I actually discovered rather late, which sounds shocking. But that, in a weird way, made the impact of him even bigger, because it was like, I had listened to so many bass CDs, and, at the time, a lot of them I was extremely disappointed with. And there were some that really stood out that I was like, oh, wow, this sounds really great. This sounds really great. I remember Duncan McTeer's recordings and Joel Corrington's at the time. I was like, oh, wow, this is really great. And then I found a Gary Karr recording. And for me, it just blew everything else out of the water. And ever since I have been like, wow, this is incredible. This is really on another level of communication, like what you just said, and connecting with the audience and the listener. And so I remember when I went to Karr Camp, and also, I grew up in South Africa, which is so far away from everything, and you really feel like that. So meeting anybody any musician that you really admire is a really big thing. And I remember the first day of Karr camp, and he walked into the room and we're all there, and I almost just started applauding. I'm glad I didn't, because I would have been alone. But because it was just like so surreal that like I was like, wow, this person, who means so much, who's done so much for all of us bassists. He's just there, and it's weird. I find that's a weird thing about sort of famous people, is that at a certain point through their notoriety, they become kind of more than a person, which is, whilst they are just people. So it's, it's a very tricky sort of thing. So the beginning was, it was a bit surreal for me. And on the other hand, my opinion did change, thank goodness. In the very beginning, because of course and actually this was the beauty of Karr camp, was that there was no audition. It was for whomever just loved to play the bass. So we're really there with people such as myself who played quite a while, and were very serious. Let's put it that way. And then, I mean, everybody was serious, but I was really, a serious little teenager. And there were people who were professionals, who had been playing, who had a job for years. And then there were also people who had been playing for 6 months. And I remember, and this is again getting back to this sort of cynical 19-year-old, I remember being so skeptical about that, because I thought, I'm sorry, but that's all very lovely that that somebody who's been playing for 6 months, loves the bass and wants to come here. But what realistically are they going to get out of this? And so I remember in the very beginning being kind of sort of looking on with this sort of dual perspective of wanting to soak everything up, but also being a bit skeptical. And it was interesting because at a certain point, I did realize, and it happened early, luckily, that actually the way he taught was indeed beneficial to all of us, actually. It was beneficial to, the person who was learning to play a scale, and to the person who was tackling whatever difficult concerto. And that was quite impressive. And it was, I don't know, it was, so like on the playing perspective, I don't know, it was very interesting, because it was also a little bit like the sort of learning all not the tricks, but kind of, like how he produces sound. He just taught us that. And you're like, oh, okay. Oh, that's it. I mean, and of course that, it's not that it's that simple, but it felt like a lot of mystery was solved, for me at least. And I must say he is very, I mean, I love him, and I think he's incredible, and I think there's nobody like him. But I do find it interesting that I find it tough to talk about his teaching, because he plays in such a specific way, mm-hmm. and I feel like there's a lot to be had from how he plays. But on the other hand, I don't want to sound like a clone. You know what I mean? And I don't. And so it was. I came completely converted. At the end, playing everything close to the bridge, and vibrato, and full on. And it's funny because I had sort of last year I had a bit of a full circle moment where I spent 10 days with him and Harmony in Las Vegas with my pianist, and we had lessons. And it was very intense, because we had a lesson every day. And it was really interesting, because I feel like in these last, 9, nearly 10 years, my playing has developed a lot, luckily, thank goodness. And I feel like when I came out of Karr camp, I was playing, my bass was super upright. Everything was close to the bridge. And because you also have this sense when you go there, you don't want to lose the magic, because you feel like you've gotten this stardust and it works, you suddenly everybody, the bass, you can hear it, and there's no, like all these things that Gary Karr is famous for. Suddenly you kind of have an insight into how they work. And so you want to play everything like that. And I feel like that's how I came out of Karr camp, all those years ago. And since like I said, my playing has developed. And so when I went to him last year, it was really interesting because I felt like it was much more of, okay, well, I you know, and he was great and he was tough, I must say. He cracked the whip, which was great. But there was also a sense of, okay, I want to take that stardust, and if we're going to call it that, and see how I can improve things that I believe in already, musically with it, which is kind of how I approached it. And I'm so glad I did, because the sound got so much better after singing for 10 days. And, all these things. I mean, there was in every aspect, there was something to be improved and gained from him. And so it was so valuable. And I don't know. And on a personal level, he's so generous with his time and accessible and doesn't, and humble and I really admire that. And I think, wow, that's great to get to that point in your career and life and just be so comfortable with yourself.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was the Karr camp experience for me was a very it was an intense kind of experience, but it was a great one. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what a great experience to spend those 10 days with him and in Las Vegas and further down your career like you are at this point. And it's exciting. I just got to congratulate you on what you're doing. I think it's really cool. I mean, you're super interesting career. You're a fabulous player and just really continuing to forge new paths for people. And I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time because we could chat for like 9 hours and we promise me we could do a round 2 some point in round 3.
Yes, I would love to.
We could do an episode just on like what's it like going from South Africa to Russia to the Netherlands. I mean that alone. Yeah. But there's one thing I'd love to dig into a little bit, and a lot of young people listen to this, and a lot of people here in the States, and I know everywhere, but especially here in the States, I think just the even idea of being a solo bassist. It's a tough road to hoe anywhere, but like. It is. So like someone who's 17, 18, 19, maybe even that age like you were, and now here you are a successful solo bassist. You have this thriving career. You're organizing festivals. What might you tell one of these young people listening if they have an inkling of maybe doing something kind of like you're doing? What advice might you offer these folks?
Yeah. Well, I would say, look, it is a tough road to hoe, like you said. It really is, and it's because you encounter you encounter an awful lot of prejudice, because as a bass player, people judge you on your instrument. I mean, and I think a lot of instrumentalists judge each other on the instrument. So there's an opinion before you've even played a note, and that is a shame, but I feel like for anybody who wants to, like you say, wants to be a soloist, wants to go down this road, the answer to that is not to, you've kind of got to accept that is unfortunately the way it is and not get bitter and cynical about it. Because it's funny, I think that's tough, and I know this, especially and among bassists, it's also it can be rife, this idea of orchestral versus solo, and I feel like it's unnecessary. I mean, I think it's fine. Everybody has their place, and for some people that's in an orchestra, and that does not mean that those people are less capable players. And the opposite is also true. You can have everybody has their place. Everybody has their needs and their desires. And being a great musician is sort of above and beyond being either a great orchestra player or a great soloist. And it's interesting because I remember I had the great fortune of having a few lessons from Anna Belsma, the Dutch cellist, and he lives in Amsterdam, and he told me, and I remember, so I was like, oh yeah, that's such a good way of looking at it. He said, yeah, I never really wanted, I never had an ambition of being this great big soloist. I just really believed in this music, and I really to do it and he was working in the Concertgebouw for years, and I think he was well into his 30s when he decided to record the suites, and he just did it so well that it ended up becoming a career, and he had to leave his orchestra, and that and not to say, because then some people would sometimes make the argument, well, then you shouldn't go for a solo career; it will just happen if you're lucky. I don't believe in that. Especially in this day and age, there are so many people on the planet, and so many of them are extremely talented and good. I do believe in going for what you believe in, but with respect to everybody around you and respect for yourself as well, I guess is what I would say. Not to sound vague, but it's basically take the opportunities in front of you, even if they don't look like they fit into what you want, but also, keep in mind what your end goal is. You don't want to get completely sidetracked, but because I think, like in some orchestra work that I've done, especially when I was in conservatory and you had to play an orchestra, I learned so much. That you don't want to be one of these people who's like, oh my God, if I end up playing in an orchestra, or if I have to play in an orchestra, it's just going to be the worst thing ever. No, there's something to be learned from every situation. And just keep your goal in mind, and be faithful to it, and don't give up on yourself. I think that's what I would have to say.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful sentiments. Thank you, James, so much for chatting. And again, jamesoesi.com will get you links to everything that he's up to, and he is up to a lot. Definitely follow him on YouTube, follow him on Facebook, and yeah, what an artist. That's going to do it for today's episode. I have such a great time chatting with people, and I get such a kick out of connecting with someone across continents and oceans, like with James. I think we scheduled something. It was late afternoon for him. It was 6 a.m. for me, but we're chatting and we pick up this conversation. We've never spoken before, in person or otherwise, and it's just like we're already close friends. And that's just something that I have so much fun discovering as I do this podcast, just this shared bond that we all have as bass players. I'm having such a great time, and I would love to hear from you, whether you just want to say hi. Hey, Jason, what's up? That's cool. I love hearing from people about anything. But if you've got any ideas for a show, I listen and I incorporate those ideas. I'm working on one about performance, mental toughness, that kind of thing from a listener. And I've got one that I'm putting together about school auditions. Actually, that'll probably be out already by the time you hear this. And those are just listener suggestions. So if you have anything you'd like to suggest in terms of guests or topics, or again, just to say hi, feedback at Contrabass Conversations. And we are active on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. You can follow us there, and you can get links to all of that at our website, contrabassconversations.com. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, or you don't know how to subscribe, you're not sure what that means, all that info is on our website as well. We have a wonderful team putting these episodes together. Michael Cooper and Steve Hinchy are our audio editors. Mitch Mooring is our audio engineer, and Trevor Jones does the publication and promotion. I'm your host, Jason Heath, coming to you from San Francisco, California, where the parrots fly overhead and the cruise ships honk their horns when I'm trying to record a podcast. And I just feel so lucky to be here chatting with you each and every week. That's going to do it for today's episode, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum. Na, na, na.